Good evening.
Good afternoon.
We are continuing our study of translation and Bible difficulties, and this is part 3. And I think that at some point, once I get everything the way I want it to be, I might put these notes on our website.
Okay.
And maybe we can make a note or something by the notes that it goes to this particular Wednesday night series or whatever.
Have you seen what I'm doing now?
I have not, but I assume it looks great.
So on there now, on the website, on the podcast website, it has the notes from each, from your sermons on Sunday specifically,
Gotcha.
right? So for that day, I'll put your notes, the stuff that you hand out.
Yeah.
I'll put that in there. For Wednesday nights, I've been just putting, as people listening to this probably know already, I just put, this is a free flow discussion, and the fact that we this is what we're talking about, and specific verses that we talked about.
Okay, good. So. Good. Maybe we can add these later.
Yeah.
I'm just going to keep adding to it. We're not going to finish all of these tonight. We probably won't finish them all next week. And I just keep adding to it because we're doing a series, right? And I don't know when it'll end. We might end up switching to something else, but this is a fun, like you said, a free flow conversation about interesting verses. And these are talked about online a lot.
Okay.
So some of the ones that I'm picking are ones that you would classify as controversial, or if you were to type them in with certain keywords, you're going to see page after page after page of articles from different sides arguing over these particular passages.
Right.
So I'm just trying to look at these verses and show the reader that you can trust the Word of God, and the errors that people point to evaporate upon closer investigation. And that's all we're doing on Wednesdays, is closely investigating these things. So one of these that we're going to start with tonight is in Exodus 20:13, and you may be familiar with this already, but thou shalt not kill.
Right.
One of the 10 commandments, right? We're actually not going to start in Exodus 20:13 because that's the verse, right? But I want to compare how the term is used in Exodus 20 in other places of the Bible, like Numbers. And so we're actually going to start in Numbers 35, because this term in Hebrew, ratzak, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. If I'm not, just forgive me, okay? I am a Gentile, and I'm from North Georgia. So my Hebrew accent is probably not impeccable, to say the least. But anyways, in Numbers 35:11 and 30, we're going to look at a couple places where this is translated and see how Exodus 20 can be made sense of. Because what some people will say is in Exodus 20, when it talks about killing, that's a contradiction, because in other places in the Bible, God literally tells his people to kill in certain scenarios, whether it be capital punishment, or in Exodus chapter, I think it's 22, mentions killing in self-defense. If somebody breaks into your house at night and you strike them down so that they die, that person's blood will not be on your hands.
Go kill all of those Amalekites.
Yeah, exactly. So when it talks about killing, and then in Exodus 20, it says don't kill, people will say, well, God's contradicting himself. He's two-faced. Over here he's saying kill, over here he's saying don't kill.
Right.
But we need to understand the terms involved. And so let's look at Numbers 35:11, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the Hebrew involved. So in Numbers 35:11, it says, then ye shall appoint you cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the slayer may flee thither, which killeth any person at unawares. So this is talking about accidental killing. So I've heard it described this way. Let's say you are on a ladder and you're passing down something to someone who's underneath you, and you're not really paying attention to what you're doing. And let's say you're taking a stone and you're passing it down to this person, and you throw that stone down, you're being unceremonious about it, and you drop the stone right on that guy's head.
Right.
And the guy dies.
Yeah.
Okay. That would be an example of what's being talked about here.
Sure.
Okay. That person would then flee to a city of refuge. There were appointed cities. It's all talked about here.
Yep.
And then they would assess whether or not
what
this
happens.
was, like what happened here. Was it actual murder? If it wasn't murder, then the person would be cleared of guilt if it was truly an accident.
Sure.
So anyways, that's the context. So in verse 11, when it uses the word killeth in the KJV, killeth in Hebrew is ratzak, and it's a lot broader than first degree murder. So when modern translations, and this isn't necessarily wrong, because in Exodus 20, verse 13, when it says don't kill, it is talking about killing in an unlawful manner. And we in modern English would define unlawful taking of life as murder. That's the way we would define it or explain it. And so it's not wrong necessarily to say you shall not murder. However, here, this is talking about accidental killing, and the word in Exodus 20 would prohibit that too. So how do you prohibit accidental killing? Well, accidental killing would also be like a person getting behind the wheel of a car, having drunk alcohol.
Oh, drinking that one.
Yeah. Okay, this person has made a really bad choice. They run over somebody.
Yeah.
So did they intentionally run over this person? Of course they didn't. If it was truly an accident, they didn't intend to do it, but it's not murder in a premeditated sense. So the word in Hebrew in Exodus 20 would prohibit not only killing intentionally, but killing through irresponsibility, through negligence. So, we talk to our kids all the time about how you can prevent accidents, right? You'll get on to them for doing something and they'll say, well, it was just an accident, but could you have prevented that accident?
Right.
Yes, they could have. Okay. Thus the guilt, not the same kind of guilt, not the same degree of guilt, but it's still guilt. So I would say that the term as it's used in Exodus is not exclusively referring to premeditated first degree murder. It's referring to a broader category. And that's why I think the King James translators, and probably not just the King James, there may be some other translations that render it this way. I wonder if the MEV renders it this way, but kill would get both of those in there. It would get in the killing through negligence and the murdering.
Right. The MEV does say the word kill.
Okay. So I don't know what the New King James says, but I would venture to guess that it's probably the same.
I think it is.
But those are a few translations that keep the term general enough to include the Hebrew ideas of both killing by negligence and killing through premeditated murder.
So what's the word you say it is?
It's if you were to transliterate it, it's RAT SACH.
That's what I thought.
Ratzah.
And I'm looking at this is, what app is this? This is eSword.
eSword.
And they show that word under Strong's as Nakah. Nakah.
Well,
and that's why I'm asking. It's
a good question. I mean, there are multiple words used to slay and to murder and to kill. So I'm gonna real quick use my phone that you gave me.
Did I?
You did give me this phone, and it's actually pretty quick, so it shouldn't take me long to look up this verse. My other phone would have taken us ages to do that. So I hope that I wrote this down right. I mean, I took these notes the other day. No, I mean, I got it right here. For Exodus 2013, it is Strong's 7,523 is the number. Okay. And the standard form, of course, it's conjugated in different ways, but Ratzah means to murder or to slay in Strong's Concordance, and the Brown Driver's Brig says murder or slay.
Okay.
And it includes manslaughter without intent. And it lists Numbers 35 as a place where the term is used. So let me real quick. Yeah, it uses Numbers 35:30.
Yeah, Numbers 35:11 is the other word.
It's the other word. Okay. Okay, come on.
I have that right?
Hurry up. Go faster, phone. Okay, so anyways, Numbers 35:30 is one of the references that I have here. It has Mechah, that's true, but it does have Ratzak later in the verse. So let's look at that verse. So Numbers 35:30, yes. Whoso killeth any person, that is Mechah. Whoso killeth any person, the murderer shall be put to death by the mouth of witnesses, but one witness shall not testify against any person to cause him to die. So when it talks about the putting to death by the mouth of witnesses, that is capital punishment. That's lawful,
Right.
and the term is ratzach. So that shows that the term ratzach in that case doesn't even refer to killing by negligence, and that's where I was going with that. It has a broader meaning, and it includes capital punishment, which is lawful. And then Numbers 35:11.
Yeah, what do you have it as? I
Okay.
mean, the real question is which app has the actual.
No,
You know
I
what I'm
mean
saying? You know?
that is correct. It is make. It's actually pronounced make. It's Strong's 5221, and that
Right.
is what it is in Numbers 35:11.
Okay.
Um,
Still, kill, make, slaughter, murder, punish, slaughter, slay, smite,
so
strike.
yes. But no, the word right here,
Posh.
manslayer is 75:23. So it is in there.
Sure.
It is there. It's just it's not translated literally as kill in the interlinear. So in the interlinear Bible, it's manslayer. That's how they would render the participle. It's actually a verb. So it's call participle.
The slayer.
And so it's
there you go. I see.
rotsecha. That's how you would pronounce it, rotsecha. And it is from ratzach. Again, that's the
right 75:20
standard. And so yeah, it's there. Okay, that's where I was going with it.
I'm sorry, I didn't.
You're making me second guess myself. But no, I'm glad that we did that because that clears some stuff up. So anyways, Numbers 35:11 and Numbers 35:30 both include ratzach in one form or another.
Yeah.
And it's used in 11 as manslaughter, and it's used in verse 30 as capital punishment. So it's a very broad term. It just means to slay, whether you slay with intent, whether you slay accidentally, or whether you slay according to God's judgment. It means to slay. So anyways, there's no contradiction there. The reason that I wanted to do this example is because I remember in 8th grade, not 8th grade, sorry, it was a little bit later than that. I think it may have been sophomore year, but I did a presentation. I had to do a public speaking thing in my English literature class.
Okay.
And because I was a Christian, I wanted to try to put my faith in there somewhere.
Sure.
So I did the English Bible. And since the English Bible was in the Renaissance, and that was covering the period that I was supposed to talk about, lots of different topics that were about the Renaissance in that class. I can't remember hardly any of the ones that the students shared, but I remember doing the one on the Bible. And afterwards, a lot of people started talking to me. I had brought in my Hebrew, Greek, interlinear Bible to show students that this is the original language. This is what it looks like.
Sure.
And so it was kind of cool. I had a good conversation with a number of them. One guy came up though and said, yeah, in the Bible it says thou shalt not kill, but there's all these examples of God telling people to kill other people.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean? Now, it wasn't really a question asked with the intent to learn though. You could tell it was more of an objection, but I did go to that place and I showed him the word, and I did my best at the time. I mean, this is sophomore year of high school. I did my best to pronounce the word. I was learning a little bit of Hebrew just for fun. Which, I know that's kind of weird, but I pronounced the word, and I said, this word is a lot broader than just to murder. So it includes these ideas. So there's not really a contradiction if you understand the word involved. Obviously, God says don't murder. But when it says don't kill here, it's not saying don't kill without exception. It's talking about a specific type of killing that God is prohibiting. And the reason the word kill is used in the broad sense is because when you go from Hebrew to English, you got to pick a word, right? And I think that everybody, well, not everybody, most people listening to this perhaps would agree that when it comes to any Bible translation, even if one is without demonstrable error, I mean, it's sound, okay? It's not going to carry over every nuance from the original language.
No.
It's just not possible.
Right.
And if it did, then there'd be no purpose in studying the Hebrew and the Greek. And I think that that'd be foolish. It's very rewarding to study Hebrew and Greek. So even if we could say that's not an error, you may be able to get something out of it by going to the underlying Hebrew text or Greek text, depending on which testament you're in. So I find that it's insightful for this commandment, thou shalt not kill, to look at the Hebrew, because it shows us that there really is no inconsistency in the Bible here. God's not saying on the one hand, don't kill in an absolute sense, And then over here, well, I want you to kill. I want you to kill this person in capital punishment. I want you to, kill to protect your family. I want you to go kill these different nations. Like,
right.
so God's not contradicting himself there. Anyways.
I mean, in every, well, not every language, a lot of different languages other than English, because English is apparently very bland, have different meanings for, we'll have the one, for instance, we have the one word snow, right? For snow. It's snow. It's a wet snow, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But the Inuit or the Eskimos, they have, I don't know, 50 words.
Yeah.
For the word snow.
Wow.
So
that's insane.
Right. So that's why
That makes sense.
Digging into this kind of, you really have to understand the meaning of the word and the application.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the disadvantages of translation.
Right.
You do get the general essential idea.
Right.
But like with the different kinds of snow in English, when you're translating, okay, he picked up and then used one of those words, okay, one of those 50 words. He picked up in English, it had to be snow.
Right.
And you might qualify it somehow to try to, but really, if you were just going to go word for word, you got to pick a word to keep it simple, right?
Yeah.
So you'd say snow. You picked up snow.
Yeah.
But for a person who spoke that language, Inuit, they'd say, well, that's not adequate. You need more, right? It's not necessarily wrong. Yeah,
Sure.
this is snow, but there's more to it than just snow, right?
Exactly right.
So anyways, it's the same way with Bible translation. So every time someone is pointed out there's an error, I've always been able to look it up and say, well, it may appear that way. You just got to do a little bit of research.
Right.
But again, that's the nature of translation. You have to be aware of the original language. So anyways, that is one particular issue that I wanted to look at. Now we're going to talk about one that's just fun. I don't know how anybody could be interested in this. And of course, I have kids all the time that ask me, are unicorns in the Bible?
Oh, it's awesome.
And I'm like, kinda. So take your Bibles and turn to Numbers 23. So we were just in Numbers 35. So Numbers 23, 22. There are lots of references to unicorns in the King James Bible, and modern versions do not have unicorns at all. So this is one of those things that people will say the King James is inaccurate here. And I do appreciate, and I recommend for anybody that's listening to check out Answers in Genesis. That website, there's a really good article by, I think it's Georgia Purdom. I think that's the author of the article, but it's a extensive article on unicorn. It's not one of their short summary articles. It's a pretty long article, but it goes into this issue really well, and I think it gives a very good assessment. Tim Chafee, who also works for Answers in Genesis, but he's got his own apologetics website. It's called Midwest Apologetics.
Right.
He's got an article on this too, and they're both exceptional, really good. So anyways, let's look at Numbers 23, verse 22. God brought them out of Egypt. He hath, as it were, the strength of a unicorn. So I have a footnote here, and I recommend this study Bible. It's a good Bible to have on your shelf, okay? So the Defined King James Version, it gives lots of definitions, and the person who created this built-in dictionary looked into the dictionaries that represent the English used at the time that the 1611 KJV was made. Because there have been some changes in words, obviously. But unicorn, he defines it here as an obscure word, one-horned rhinoceros, used in the Middle English Old Testament to render the Latin Vulgate unicornus, or rhinoceros, and retained in later versions. Hebrew is probably the great aurochs or wild bulls, which are now extinct, but the exact meaning is not known. And that's a really good summary of this whole issue.
Sure.
So the Latin word unicornus is still in zoology used to describe the one-horned Indian rhinoceros.
Sure.
Okay, so when they used the word unicorn to translate this, they were not envisioning a fluffy white horse with a horn
that poops rainbows.
Or Skittles or whatever. They were not thinking of that. So for the skeptics, if you happen to be a skeptic, just do a little bit of study, okay? You can fact check me on this, but unicornus is still used, and at the time was used to refer to a rhinoceros.
Right.
And to give additional proof of this, I'm going to give you some more references. But the official Latin name for an Indian rhinoceros is Rhinoceros unicornis. It's called that because it has one horn as opposed to two. So the African rhinoceros, if you were to see them, they have more than one horn. One's more prominent than the other. The one in front is more prominent than the one in back, right behind it. But the Indian rhinoceros just has that single horn. That's why it's pretty unique. In Isaiah 34:7, in the margin of the King James. So if you don't have a 1611, get one, because it's also got a lot of marginal notes, and it shows that these translators, they understood that the Hebrew sometimes had that nuance it's hard to carry over.
Mm-hmm.
And because they weren't exactly sure which nuance to go with, they put it in the margin. And so in Isaiah 34:7, it says unicorn, but in the margin it says rhinoceros. And unicornis in Latin means literally one horn. Now in Hebrew, what's the term? So that's the question. So that justifies the King James translators' use of a term that may seem fabulous or fantastical, but it's talking about a real world animal.
Right.
Okay. But the question is a one-horned rhinoceros the best interpretation or translation of the Hebrew term? So the Hebrew term, this is like a hard one to pronounce. I think it's ruaim. So it's like a ruaim. So I think it's more like a ruaim if you were to pronounce it quick. I'm just going to say raim.
Sounds like you're saying the word backwards. Raim.
Raim.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say raim because it's easy for me to do. But if you were to transliterate it, it would be reem. But anyways, in Psalm 92 verse 10, it suggests one horn. So let's look at that real quick. This is one of those verses that is often pointed to justify the one-horned interpretation.
Say Psalm 92:10.
It's a Psalm 92:10. I'm turning there myself. Okay, this is, I assume, David. I don't think that it's necessarily part of the Psalm title that it's David.
It doesn't say.
But Psalm 92 verse 10, but my horn shalt thou exalt like the horn of a unicorn. I shall be anointed with fresh oil. Okay. And again, the footnote here in the Defined King James tells us all the same thing: unicornus, rhinoceros, etc. However, there's a controversial verse, and it's in Deuteronomy 33, where it also translates it as unicorn, but this particular verse seems to suggest more than one horn. And if it does have more than one horn, you can't call it a unicorn.
What was it again? I'm sorry.
It's Deuteronomy 33:17. Deuteronomy 33:17. So this is the one where they accuse the King James translators of making an oopsie. And it appears that way at first. So let's look at it. So Deuteronomy 33:17. His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns.
That doesn't make any sense.
With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. Okay, so the horns of the unicorns here is obviously referring to Joseph's descendants. Okay, Ephraim and Manasseh. But some people will say that the Hebrew term raim refers to an oryx or a wild bull. And so a wild bull has two very prominent horns. The oryx had very large horns.
Very large, yep.
So that's what they think it's referring to. However, it has been argued, and not just by the KJV translators, it's been argued that the term here for unicorn is, though literally singular, it's functionally plural. So if you were to look at the Hebrew, the word raim is not plural here. So horns of unicorns wouldn't really tell you how many horns the unicorns have. It could just be, okay, you got a bunch of animals and the horns that belong to those animals. So that maintains, from the King James perspective, that unicorns have one horn. You're talking about a group of unicorns, so they have lots of horns, among them, right?
Sure.
So that's how they rendered it. However, some people accuse them of changing the term in Hebrew from singular as it is to plural just to make unicorn work. So that's the argument, right? But there's actually an ancient example of other Jewish translators, or not other because the King James aren't Jewish translators, but Jewish translators rendering it in a similar way. So the Jewish translators of the LXX, they translated the singular rame with the singular monoceratos.
Mm.
And this refers to a one-horned animal in
Yes.
the Greek.
Yes.
So this is not like the other portions of the Greek Bible, which some came much later. These first 5 books are probably the oldest out of all the Greek Bible. And they
Right.
probably were translated by a group of Jewish scholars who knew Greek
Right.
a couple hundred years
Right.
before Christ, right?
Mhm.
The others were probably translated over an extended period of time and added later on.
Mhm.
You can tell the styles are very different,
Right.
but there's a unity to the first 5 books. So these Jewish translators, they saw the singular word rame, and they had no problem translating this as monoceratos, even though that kind of conflicts with the plural horns. The horns
Yeah.
of a one-horned animal.
Yeah.
So where did they get off doing that? Well, it's common knowledge that sometimes you can have a singular term have a plural meaning depending on how it's used. And one example that is given is in Isaiah 11:7. Isaiah 11:7. And this is talking about the millennial kingdom. It's an awesome passage. And it says, "And the cow and the bear shall feed their young ones." "And the cow and the bear shall feed their young ones, shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox."
Right.
So here it's not talking about like there's literally one cow and one
Multiple.
bear.
Right. Yeah.
It's
yeah,
talking
yeah.
about a class.
Right.
So what is argued is that the term in Hebrew, rame, is a generic term. So it's a class of animals.
Sure.
And that's why the King James translators rendered it plural, because even though literally it's not plural, it's a class.
Yes.
So if you were bringing that into English, the most natural way to translate it would be plural with an S at the end. So unicorns rather than unicorn. So that's one of those things. It's kind of iffy, you know. I can see someone making an argument for an oryx with 2 horns. Okay, I can look at the text and I can see that as reasonable. However, I wouldn't say that the way the King James translators have it is an error, because they weren't the first people to come up with this idea. And they also had something else on their side, so I'm going to give you a little more information. Oh, by the way, I have a note here. It wasn't Georgia Purdom who wrote that article. It was Elizabeth Mitchell on the Answers in Genesis website.
Okay.
But she points out that the KJV translators, they drew from the wisdom of Jewish Hebrew experts. So in their time, there were a number of really famous rabbis that wrote books and published those books that was introducing Hebrew grammar to Gentiles.
Sure.
And so they were very much aware of these. And one of them was David Kimchi.
I've heard of that name before, yeah.
And so these are people who knew Hebrew really well, but they maintained that in this particular place, in Deuteronomy 33:17, that unicorns had 1 horn. So there's a number of rabbis from the Middle Ages who would say that rame in Hebrew is definitely referring to an animal with 1 horn. Now, they weren't all in agreement. There were some people who believed that they had more than 1 horn, but some of the more prominent Hebrew scholars that the KJV translators were aware of, they made commentaries on texts just like this.
Right.
And they believed that the rame was a single-horned animal. For example, Abraham Yeagle, he's a rabbi. I think he was an Italian Jew. He mentions that a single-horned rame had been captured and brought to Portugal. And the way he describes it, it fits with what we know about a rhinoceros.
Okay.
So he is calling this animal a rame. And so you could say, oh, well, that's, medieval rabbi.
Yeah.
At the time, he thinks that Hebrew term is a rhinoceros.
Sure.
But how do you know it meant that way back when? Well, we don't know, right? That's why it's a translation difficulty.
So,
but Go ahead.
So my question is, what did how can I put this? What did the guys in 1611 think a unicorn was?
Okay. They thought a unicorn was a single horn rhinoceros.
Okay.
Yes.
So how did we get, and this is whatever, right? This is not biblical. How do we get from that to a unicorn of a horse with one? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Like,
well, okay.
Where
So,
did that come from?
Yeah, definitely fabulous.
Yeah.
Lots of fantastical stuff accumulates around truth. And there are a lot of things like that we're looking at in this particular series that are
Sure.
just like that, where you have the popular conception of something like unicorn being completely different from what it was to people back then.
Yeah.
So there was the popular view, which in some cases did exist back then, but then there was the people who were like, yeah, they're unicorns, but they don't look anything like that. And
Right.
for example, I want to quote this from Marco Polo. So
Sure.
he's living in the 13th century.
Yeah.
And so he goes to Sumatra, or he's describing the unicorns in Sumatra. I don't know if he actually went there, but anyways.
Yeah.
He says they have wild elephants and plenty of unicorns, which are scarcely smaller than elephants. They have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant's. They have a single large black horn in the middle of the forehead. They are very ugly brutes to look at. They are not at all such as we describe them when we relate that they let themselves be captured by virgins. But they are clean contrary to our notions. So he's looking at these animals and he's saying, these are unicorns. What is a unicorn? It's a one-horned animal. But he said the one-horned animals that we're used to talking about in our stories, like that we tell to our kids.
Got you. Okay.
Nothing like this one-horned animal.
We're talking about a rhinoceros.
Yeah, he says this is what it is, okay? And it's nothing like our stories. But what's interesting is he seems to be describing a type of rhinoceros that's not in existence anymore.
Right.
So there are no rhinoceros today that are almost the size of an elephant. Like elephants are bigger than rhinoceros.
Yeah.
Okay. If you were to compare, let's take an African rhinoceros and compare it to an African elephant.
Right.
Okay, an elephant towers over rhinoceros.
Yes.
So he seems to be saying that they're much bigger, but even besides that,
the hair.
He says the hair of a buffalo.
Yeah.
And while there are some Sumatran rhinos today that have hair, it's very short.
Interesting.
It's nothing like a buffalo.
It's so possible that he's, maybe.
So what some people have said is he's describing what's called an elasmotherium, or the woolly rhinoceros. So we have from the fossil record remains of the woolly rhinoceros, and they were huge. They were the same size roughly as elephants.
Right.
So if it's the description here, scarcely smaller than elephants. I mean, they are comparable to the size of elephants. They're covered in shaggy black hair, and they have a single prominent horn.
No joke. Wow.
And I'm pretty sure from my recollection of the fossil reconstructions, they had a single black horn. You might want to look that up. Yeah. But it's called an elasmotherium. It's huge. Like, this horn is nothing like modern day rhinoceros at all. I mean, it is insane. And it was actually attached to the skull. Modern day rhinoceros don't have true horns. They have horns that are made out of keratin, which is just fused hair.
Right.
So the elasmotherium actually had a real horn, like I suppose like an elephant's tusk, okay, or similar to it. Yeah. So look up a picture of it, and you'll be very much impressed.
Well, woolly rhinoceros. That word in my mouth today. This is saying interesting, and this of course is wiki, which is these days has just gone off.
A rhinoceros is big, y'all. But if you were to look at an elasmotherium, I just want you to go on Google and do a size comparison of a regular rhinoceros, as you might see in a movie, on safari.
Yes.
Compare that to an elasmotherium. An elasmotherium is much larger. It's twice as big.
Yeah, this is
so.
Yeah,
that seems to be what Marco Polo have seen in the 13th century, and I've actually seen people say woolly rhinoceros may actually have lived alongside people.
Well,
in recent history, and they'll say that as if it's really insightful. It's like, well, of course they did. We as Bible believers know that they lived alongside him.
Yes.
But
just like the mammoths did, and so
another thing that I've read is that an Indian rhinoceros, a one-horned Indian rhinoceros, they're pretty placid animals, so they're not really violent. But in Job 39, apparently, the unicorn was such that, I mean, you don't mess with a unicorn. It's listed up there with unicorn, behemoth, leviathan. So it's
Yeah.
progressively, we're talking about, bigger and badder. But the unicorn is such that you can't domesticate it. Okay. If you try to domesticate
Yeah.
it, you try to capture it. All right. You're
It's
probably
gonna-
going to die.
Yes.
So an elasmotherium seems to fit this a little bit more than maybe a modern day rhino,
Yes.
because modern day rhinos, like, yeah, we can capture them and put them in zoos and, domesticate them to an extent. So it may be that this type of animal that's described in the Bible, the unicorn, the ram, was a lot more vicious than anything we have today, even though it was related
Yes.
to the rhinoceros that live in our time. Another thing, and just this is the last thing I want to mention about it. There is this idea floating around among some young Earth creationists that the unicorn may, in fact, be a dinosaur. And the reason they say that is because there have been fossil remains discovered of
Absolutely.
one-horned dinosaurs, and they are if you read Job 39, 40, and 41, in Job 40 and 41, we have dinosaurian animals described.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the unicorn's described in 39. And so some people suggest maybe we're talking about the biggest animals that ever lived.
Mm.
And were there any one-horned animals that, were dinosaurs? Yeah, there were. And,
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
Centrosaurus, the Monoclonius, these are some types of one-horned dinosaurs. In fact, the Ishtar Gate, which I think in the late 1800s or
Yeah,
early
yeah.
1900s was excavated
Yeah.
and restored. The chief archaeologist was Robert Coldaway. He was a German. He noticed that there was this animal that looked dinosaurian. So you have all these different animals that are recognizable, like a lion. You could see all these different kinds. And then you get to this one, and it's called the Sarouche. And the Sarouche is, if you look it up, and it's spelled Sirrush, the Sarouche has one horn. So it walks on four legs. It's got a longish tail,
Okay.
It's a scaled creature. It's definitely reptilian, but it's got one horn. And he believed, this is kind of funny. This is, when people were still learning about dinosaurs and maybe evolution hadn't become such as much a dogma.
Right.
But this guy, Robert Coldaway, believed the Sarouche was some type of dinosaur, maybe like an iguanodon. So he was arguing that this animal was describing not a mythological creature, as many people they believe, but this was describing a real animal that lived in the past that the Babylonians were aware of.
Right.
So there's a possibility. And I want to read you this. This is from, I found this on, I think, Genesis Park. It's a great website.
Okay.
But he's quoting from The Horned Dinosaurs, A Natural History by Peter Dotson. And this is what it says. In his classic work, Naturalis Historia, the first century author Pliny the Elder described an exceedingly wild beast called the Monoceros, which is what we found, by the way, in the Septuagint.
Okay.
The Monoceros.
Right.
It makes a deep lowing noise. It has one black horn 2 cubits long, and it projects from the middle of its forehead. He describes it as like an elephant in length, but with much shorter legs. Other classic authors, like Alien, spelt Aelian, Opian, and Marshall, also mention a nose-horned creature called a rhinoceros. That's where I'm sure we get rhinoceros from.
Sure.
Some claim that the rhinoceros sharpens its horn on a rock and utilizes it in fighting elephants. This is the root word from which we get the modern name rhinoceros. But the ancient descriptions do not fit the rhino very well, even though some species do have one horn. Rhinos do not have a true horn that attaches to the skull. Rather, it is made of keratin, a hair-like substance that is similar to our fingernails. The correlation between the classical authors and some modern cryptozoological reports is striking. Dr. Roy Mackle's explorations in the Congo brought back reports of a rare single-horned animal called Emela ntuka, or killer of elephants. In a recent expedition, pygmies in Cameroon identified the horned creature there called the ngubu, identified it with a ceratopsian dinosaur, and claimed that it could sport from 1 to 4 horns. Indeed, modern researchers believe that the ceratopsian dinosaurs likely did use their great horn for combat. End quote. So, there are reports coming out of Africa of large animals that don't fit the description of rhinos, but they are one-horned animals.
Yes.
And they're comparable in size to elephants. They have thick tails, by the way. The Amelantuca, there is some local artwork that you can see a picture of it on the Genesis Park website. And it does kind of have flappy ears, so it kind of looks like an elephant, but it's got one horn, no tusks, and it's got a very thick tail, unlike hippos, rhinos, elephants.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, take away the flappy ears, which you might chalk up to stylistic, expression. It looks very much like a dinosaur, and it's big enough to kill elephants, thus earning the name Killer of Elephants. So one wonders, could the unicorn, because all the word means, by the way, as we have it in the Hebrew and as we have it in the English, it's just a one-horned animal.
Right.
And it's a vicious one.
Yes.
So it could be an extinct species of rhino that's so vicious that it's unlike modern day rhinos. That's a possibility, 100%. But there's also that tentative possibility that it might be an extinct dinosaur. So I'm just leaving that out there. Sure. I don't know. And I don't think I ever will know until, all things are fulfilled and I can ask Jesus these questions.
Amen.
But right now, all we could say is unicorn definitely doesn't refer to the fluffy horse in the woods that the virgins lure in and make their pets and grant their wishes. Okay.
Whatever.
All that stuff. So there's no error whenever people render this as unicorn. Okay. One more, and I think that's all we have time for.
Okay.
I don't know what time it is.
It is.
But I assume we have time.
8:30.
It's what?
Lots of time.
Okay, good. Awesome. We're moving pretty well. So Deuteronomy 23:17. Turn there. And we're going to talk about one that's kind of gross, guys. And I just saying that right there.
Gross. Come on.
Just when I said that right there, there's automatically going to be some people who probably turn us off whenever they hear what I'm about to say next. But we're going to talk about the word sodomite. I know, it's like I don't even want to talk about it now, but we got to talk about it because it's a controversial issue now, and I think that it is something worthy of discussion, even though I don't like talking about
prostitute. Yes, I remember now.
So in Deuteronomy 23:17, this is just one example. There are a number, but I just picked this one out. It says, "There shall be no whore of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. Thou shalt not bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord thy God for any vow, for even both these are abomination unto the Lord thy God." Sodomite. In modern translations, this is generally rendered as cult prostitute. When it's talking about a male cult prostitute.
Yes.
And it's rendered that way quite often in many modern versions. Now, is that correct? And why does this even matter? Well, King James advocates will argue that it's toning down a term. Sodomite clearly refers to homosexuality. It's referred to that since people looked at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and they said, okay, we're going to take the word sodomite, which first referred to an inhabitant of the city of Sodom, and we're going to make it a catchphrase for homosexuality. And even beyond that, just perversions that are against nature.
Yeah. Well, sodomy as well.
And it's exactly, and it's been used that way for hundreds of years in the English language. So when the King James translators used this, when they saw this word, in the original language, which for the male, it's kadesh.
Yeah.
When it says whore, it's kadeshah. They said kadesh refers to a sexual deviant that's male. So in English, what do you call a sexual deviant that's male? A sodomite. That was the term. And even today it's still used, even though it's fallen out of popularity for obvious reasons. But as homosexuality has become more and more accepted by our culture, there seems to be this desire when we're rendering the Bible into English in modern versions, kind of tone down the negative connotation of the word sodomite, because sodomite's never a positive term.
Right.
So male cult prostitute, it kind of makes any immorality attached to idolatry. So some people argue, and they have made this argument, that it's not speaking against homosexuality in general. It's speaking about
the cult
prostitution, a dedication to false gods. Yes, there may have been homosexuality that took place in that context, but the sin of it was that it was dedicated to a false god and it was outside of the true religion. Of course, that argument breaks down because there are many other places where it's not in any way associated with idolatry or prostitution, and the Bible still condemns homosexuality.
Yes.
I mean, so I don't think that one can really gain much by changing it from sodomite to
Yeah.
male cult prostitute.
Right.
But it seems like that's just one symptom of this broader issue.
Yeah.
And it's funny that these changes are not just happening here in the Old Testament with sodomite, but in the New Testament when Paul talks about the effeminate.
Romans 1.
I think the effeminate is in 1 Corinthians 6. But
Okay.
yes, Romans 1, you're right. They'll
Right.
say that that's talking about an abusive
Yes.
homosexual relationship. That's talking about catamites, adult males having boys for that purpose.
Yes.
And that definitely was a practice. And they'll say that is what's being referred to. However, Paul clearly says that men worked with men and women worked with women, that which
Right.
was shameful. And he puts the guilt on both parties, not just on one.
That's right.
So this is not a non-consensual abuse relationship. This is a consensual relationship, and he's condemning it.
Yes.
So today, if you say consensual homosexual relationships are acceptable, Paul would say wrong.
Right.
Okay. And you know better because your
Right.
conscience speaks against it,
Yes.
even if you say different. So anyways, we're not going to go to Romans 1. We're going to
Right.
stay here in the Old Testament. But what do the terms mean? Well, why did the King James translators understand this to refer to homosexuals? Because the medieval rabbis did.
Mm.
So it was common knowledge among the Hebrew scholars at the time that Kadesh referred to homosexuality. In fact, they would look at it this way. They would say, let me find my place here. Where is it? Here it is. Okay. So Rashi, one of the rabbis that I'm referring to, and another was Arber-Banel.
Mhm.
Probably pronouncing that wrong. Arber-Banel. But Rashi argues that Kedeshah, whore, and Kadesh, which is translated here as sodomite, they mean unbridled or prepared. And unbridled or prepared is a reference to basically like throwing off the restrictions that the Bible places on sex, as in one man, one woman in marriage, and having sex outside of those natural relations. So for a woman here, prostitution is fitting. Okay, that term would be an accurate representation
Sure.
of the term. But specifically with the word Kadesh as applied to a man, Rashi would say that a man who's unbridling himself is giving himself over to unnatural sexual relations. So not just heterosexual relations outside of marriage,
Right.
but homosexual
Yes.
relations and bestial relations. So that would be
Yes.
included as well. So this is not limited just to homosexuality, but that's definitely included in it. And homosexuality was considered deviant
Right.
according to God and according to the ancient Hebrews. So Rashi and other scholars, they rendered it that way. That's how they understood it. And that we actually have commentators by them that show the way that they handled the Hebrew terms. And I read it. I'm not going to pretend that I understood all of it, but I encourage
Sure.
you to check it out because it's on websites for free. Another thing in verse 18, when it talks about a dog, it says, "Thou shalt bring the hire of a whore or the price of a dog." This is where it's kind of uncomfortable, but the word dog, kaleb, in Hebrew, many scholars have noted this is a euphemism for a homosexual because of the position involved.
Yeah.
So won't say any more than
Yeah,
that.
sure.
But it's a picturesque way of describing a person who has unbridled themselves and has
Gotcha.
given themselves over to unnatural relations. In fact, there are many depictions in ancient
Right.
art that cement this idea. But
Huh.
again, the word dog is commonly used to refer to a man involved in homosexual acts. Also among the Hebrews, I mean, it would have a negative connotation because dogs are unclean animals. And so, a dog returns to its vomit. Okay. These are images of uncleanliness that would go along with the idea of homosexual practices being filthy in the eyes of God. But again, this doesn't just prohibit prostitution in the sense as we would understand it today. Some people think that. They'll think that this is talking just about prostitution. But the Hebrew rabbis seem to understand it to mean more than that it was an unbridling of oneself sexually in general. And verse 18 is talking about prohibiting any financial gain from that immorality. So verse 17 is prohibiting the immorality in general.
Okay.
And verse 18 is prohibiting bringing in any gain from the immorality to the temple. So if you get any money from, unbridling yourself sexually, then that would be prohibited. So rather than taking this and putting it in some supposed cultic context where these people are in another temple dedicated to another god and they're practicing this as part of their worship, it's a general prohibition of sexual immorality. And it's a prohibition of taking that immorality and getting any gain financially from it. So it prohibits both.
Yeah.
Whether you're doing it simply for pleasure, or you're doing it to get money out of it, it's prohibited.
Right.
And I'm going to quote this. This is from the Pentateuch, translated and explained by Samson Raphael Hirsch. So this is a Jewish source.
Right.
This is not a King James only source. This is respected Jewish source, and I found it on kjvtoday.net. It's got some good sources on that website, so I'm going to quote it. The word Kadesh signifies a person who is sexually immoral in a general sense. There shall be no one dedicated to immorality of the daughters of Israel, and no one dedicated to immorality of the sons of Israel. Just as Kadosh is the complete surrender to what is morally lofty and good, so is Kadesh the surrender to what is morally low and bad. An analogy can be found in the root kavar, which is as kavor, designates the impression of the spiritual moral content, and as kavar, the impression of the material content. Hope I'm pronouncing those terms right. There are no vowel pointings in this quote. Anyways, continuing the quote, immorality is every sexual intercourse which has not had the dedication of sanctification. So this Hebrew commentator is saying that the terms are kind of a play on words with the words for holy. So the word kadosh, holy, sanctified, set apart. Kadesh is a play on words, but in a negative sense.
Right.
So if kadosh is set apart for God, dedicated to God, the sanctity of marriage, as God has designed it in Genesis chapter 2. Kadesh is the exact opposite of that.
Gotcha.
Whether it is heterosexual outside of marriage, homosexual, or bestial, it's condemning all of it in one fell swoop. And the word sodomite, if you were to look up the definition of this term as it was originally used in 1611, it included not only homosexuality, but all other kinds of unnatural sexual relations. So it didn't exclusively just refer to homosexuality. It was a lot broader than that. So going back to whether or not this term fits, if you were to look in the Hebrew, it's not going to be literally sodomite. It's not going to be related to the root Sodom.
Right.
Okay. But the English term in its meaning and its definition adequately explains Kadesh
what we're talking about.
That is here in the Hebrew. So yes, I think that sodomite is a good translation, and it doesn't pull any punches. It conveys exactly what it was meant to convey. Anybody that hears that word today, they know what it means. I mean, we're here in 2022.
And we know.
But if you were to refer to a homosexual as a sodomite, they're not going to say, oh, yes, I'm a proud sodomite. Okay? Yeah. One day they might.
They probably, I think we're close to that already.
Well, they might say I'm proud to be, homosexual. But sodomite, again, has almost of an insulting connotation to it. And
well, I think there's that whole, anti-God thing. So I do think that possibly you would have people that would,
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, I know, because I mean, look at take us down a rabbit trail, but look at Burning Man. You know what I'm talking about? Burning Man that they have every year. Right. In Utah. Is that where it is? Utah?
Somewhere out west.
Nevada, Utah, I forget. And this year they had a not a sandstorm, but it was the caustic salt and stuff storm that basically they had whiteouts throughout the end of it, like it was the last few days of it. So they were basically, it was like, they couldn't see, and it took them like, I don't know, at least 8 hours to get out of there at the end on Monday.
Oh, wow.
But, I was looking at it, was like, oh, that's crazy. I was looking at the pictures, and the stuff that they're doing there is sodomites.
Yeah.
And they probably would say, "Oh yeah, me too."
God help us. You're right.
Amen, right?
You're
So
right.
I
I mean,
think that's where we're at.
we're definitely getting that place. But again, there was a time, even 10 years ago,
Oh yeah,
I mean, where the word was definitely, we know that's not what we'll call ourselves.
right.
Okay, we'd prefer to maybe be called gay or something, but we
Yes.
don't call us that. That's
Right.
And I've even heard people say, "Oh, the chief sin of Sodom and Gomorrah wasn't homosexuality; it was it was being unhospitable."
No, I'm pretty sure that's
It's
not
like,
what they're saying
no,
there.
I'm pretty sure it wasn't. I
No.
mean,
Let them out so we may know them.
yeah, exactly. So, oh goodness. But I think that we're just seeing little changes at a time. And that's what gives me a red flag. It's whenever little changes like that take place. It's not going to happen in a flood. Apostasy has been happening for a while now. I think it's been happening since the 1800s, really. I think as far as like the Christian community in Europe and in America, it's really been since the 1800s. Even during the Age of Enlightenment, you had some really loud vocal people, but the church stood its ground. And in the 1800s, there were just little things here or there that led to that slippery slope. Inerrancy, the text of scripture, just Darwinism. I mean, the virgin birth. I actually remember reading something by, I think it was B.B. Warfield. And
the fact that Mary was raped, that one?
No, it wasn't that. I don't think he said that. No, but what he did say was, do we really need the virgin birth? And while he did seem to affirm it, I was shocked to hear that many people said that Warfield was a conservative. And yet he's here saying we don't really need the virgin birth. He's like, what if hypothetically the virgin birth really was just some fabulous conception that came about later and it really didn't happen? Do we really need it?
Ooh, that's like
and stuff like that was what, there was a faithful few that stood against it as far as the scholars and the way truth was preserved. You wonder, well, how was it preserved? People in churches. That's how it was preserved. That's the priesthood of the believer, not the clergy, not the hierarchy, not the popes, not the bishops. It was the people in churches who, they were the salt and they were the light. And thankfully, they did their job well, but we do see a slight eroding. It's like the eroding of riverbanks over time. It's a little bit after a little bit, and
I don't think it's slight anymore.
No, but I mean it.
I really don't. I'm trying to find the article. I can't find it right now, but
it's kind of like a dam, maybe. It burst here and then here, and then all of a sudden, boom.
Yeah, no, this thing was it was an article where some pastor basically said, a progressive, whatever pastor you want to call it, came out and said that, and you've probably heard this before, that David raped Bathsheba.
Yeah. I've heard people speculate that. Yeah.
Right, but and they're saying that in the whole Marxist world that we're living in right now, that David raped Bathsheba and it was because of his power, which is kind of true because Bathsheba couldn't deny him because he was king, but she, I think, was a willing participant in some way because...
See, that's one of those things where I don't know, but I'm pretty sure. I'd have to check this. But we've talked about Amnon raping his sister.
Yes.
And everybody is, I mean, famous pieces of art and poems. Yes. I mean, we know that was a rape. It's gone down in history as a rape.
Right,
but not with David and Bathsheba.
Right. It's never said that.
It's never said that way. So I would say that while you may be right, it may have been like an Esther scenario where kind of taken in, expectations are known, you kind of have to go along with it. But rape would be
and what's funny is that is exactly what this article was saying is like, it's not like we're trying to hide the term rape in the Bible because exactly where you just talked about several places where the word rape is used, and in the same in 2 Samuel, I think it is.
Yeah.
Right.
Same book. Yeah.
Yeah, the same book. So But another part of the article he talks about where somebody had said that they suggested that Mary was raped by God. You know what I mean?
Oh
It was
my
like,
goodness.
yeah, right. So how awful is that? But it's not just that these are these people that are not people in the pews. We're talking about people, pastors preaching this,
Yeah, I know.
right? So that's where we are. And I think the article was actually that talked about this, that he was, talking about, was in Christianity Today. Is it
Yeah.
Christianity Today, which is liberal, I think, and
And in some ways, yeah.
yeah.
I don't hardly read their articles because I think you got to pay to read
Do you? I don't
some
know,
of
but
them. Yeah.
it sounded like it was. They kind of put that out there like that, so it was. Yeah, it was an interesting thing. The guy that wrote it is Larry Taunton. Is the article.
Well, I'll say this, and this is something that I think that applies to the discussion. Back in the day, you had the scholars, and they were trying to trickle down their ideas, but they knew they could only do it little bit by little bit. I
Mm,
mean, you could have people that would go into a seminary and it'd be made pretty plain, like the stuff that we're teaching you
right,
here, the churches are never going to take this in.
right.
So you're gonna have to little bit by little bit,
Yeah,
slide it in
slide
there.
it in there.
But the churches were on guard at that time. I think that there was just a moral, spiritual fiber that they had then that we don't have today.
Right.
Our churches are so lukewarm and materialistic that when this stuff is slipped in, it's like they're ripe for it.
Yeah.
They're ripe to be taken in the deception, to be
Yeah.
taken in the lie. And so it's the Laodicean church.
Yes.
It really is. I honestly am convinced more than ever that we are living in that time as we see so many pastors fall, as we see them succumb to critical race theory, as we see people just essentially become relativists
Yes.
and pluralistic.
Yes.
I think that we're there.
Yes.
I think there are a lot of these people who they grew up in churches and they sat under perhaps good preaching,
Yes.
but it's happened fast, like you said.
Yeah.
I mean, I can think back to when I was a kid. I can remember certain things like really getting the attention of the church.
Mm,
I'll tell you one example. Okay. Whatever your opinion is about this, hopefully you'll take this in good stride, those who are listening. But uh, Harry Potter
yes.
in the 90s,
Yes.
that was enough to strike up another satanic panic. It was, and what that illustrates is this: the church had a very strong reactionary attitude. Like, this is a threat.
Yeah.
Like, let's deal with this, you
Yeah.
know? And in some cases, that reactionary attitude may make people go overboard, but we have to say that we'd rather have it that way than have people that just let their guard down and they let anything in their churches.
Little demon.
It's better to, yes, oh my goodness, I saw that.
Yeah.
It's better to err on the side of caution,
Mm,
you know?
yeah.
And I'm convinced of that, absolutely. And we've seen how it's progressed so much theologically and entertainment. Goodness, I can't let my kids watch anything now on TV.
Mm-mm.
Just be
Not even Disney.
even these apps, because they
Oh, yeah.
have ads, and the ads are degenerate.
That's right.
So we can't let them, like, we'll be watching Little House on the Prairie,
Yeah.
Prime, and then they'll have these ads that come on. I'm like, we can't even watch this family
That's
wholesome
right.
show because they throw in these filthy ads. So, I mean, I know people have probably said this before. Look at what the world's come to, but I
Look
think
at
that,
what the world's come to.
yeah, I think that there are a lot of things that are converging, and
Yeah.
we'll talk more about those another time because we're going to be doing an end time study on Sunday soon.
Awesome.
So anyways, we're going to stop there. I'll go ahead and tell you what our sneak peek will be. Next week, we're going to talk about the cockatrice. If you have no idea what that means, we're going to talk about it.
That's good.
We're going to talk
don't.
about satyrs, and we're going to talk about dragons.
Dragons.
So yeah,
They got slewed.
they got slewed.
They got slewed, them dragons, eh?
So we're going to talk about that next week. Hopefully you join us. Good night.